Something in the room has shifted, and Rick Ross is the last person still pretending it hasn't. This is not a fall. This is not a scandal. This is something far more expensive than a bad news cycle, and if you have been watching the timeline the way I have been watching the timeline, you already sense it. The empire is still standing. The gates are still gold. The Georgia estate is still enormous. But something inside the frame has cracked, and every airport clip, every jewelry close-up, every rival's throwaway joke is now landing on him like a courtroom exhibit instead of a punchline. So before we go 1 inch further into this, hit that like button, hit subscribe, hit that notification bell, because what we are about to walk through is the kind of story the culture will still be arguing about 6 months from now. And you are going to want to be in the room when it happens. Now here is the part where Rick Ross enters the frame, and I want you to hear me out on this one, because the story that everyone thinks they are watching is not actually the story that is unfolding. On the surface, this looks like a boss rapper going through a bad stretch. Airport footage. Watch discourse. Ticket promo screenshots. A feud that refuses to die. That reading is lazy, and it is missing the whole thing. What is actually happening here is bigger than any single incident, and it explains everything about why the same man who spent 2 decades making luxury sound like a religion now cannot walk through a gate without the internet turning it into a debate. Think about it for a moment. For years, Rick Ross was not just a rapper. He was a setting. A single record could turn a Sunday drive into a boardroom, a bottle into a trophy, a chain into a treaty. The voice carried the weight of somebody who had already arrived, already survived, already collected. Port of Miami debuted at #1. Hustlin' rewired the entire template of Southern luxury rap in 2006. Teflon Don, God Forgives I Don't, Mastermind, Rich Forever, every single project sold the same visual world. Marble floors, imported cars, private flights, aged liquor, loyalty as currency. Danger as texture. And the message underneath all of it was 1 sentence long. The man was already inside a life you could only imagine. That was not marketing. That was architecture. William Leonard Roberts, too, grew up around Carroll City, Florida, with an early childhood tie to Clarksdale, Mississippi. Miami taught him something Clarksdale could not. Miami taught William Leonard Roberts, too, that presentation is protection. That aspiration can become identity. That a young man who learned to read the difference between the display window and the sidewalk could turn that same eye into a genre. When the rapper finally emerged with Hustlin', the entire performance was already fully formed. The chant, the delivery, the certainty. And from that first hit forward, he followed a rule most rappers never even learn. Hits create attention, but repetition creates mythology. Every album, every ad-lib, every appearance, every business move reinforced the same visual world until the artist himself became indistinguishable from the world he had built. Maybach Music Group expanded the frame. Meek Mill, Whale, French Montana, Amarian, all filed under the same imperial umbrella. Restaurant franchises, beverage deals, books, real estate, reported investments, tractor footage, the famous Georgia property. Champagne rituals. Slogan after slogan. Rick Ross was no longer performing wealth. He had become a living monument to it. And this is exactly where the trap was hiding. Because the moment a human being becomes a monument, the audience stops giving that person normal human grace. Monuments do not get bad days. Monuments do not get slow ticket weeks. Monuments do not fly commercial. Monuments do not wear a watch that anyone gets to question. Monuments get audited. And this artist, more than almost any rapper in the modern era, spent 20 years training the public to audit him. Hear me out on this one, because this is the part every commentator is missing. The Rick Ross story is not a bankruptcy story. It is not a fake jewelry story. It is not a feud story. The deeper story, the real one, is the price of the symbol. He built himself into a luxury symbol so complete that the symbol now owes the audience something the man cannot always deliver. Every ordinary detail becomes a stress test. Every plain moment becomes evidence. And the audience, trained by the man himself for 2 decades, now judges the symbol against itself. The corrections officer chapter was the first version of this pattern, long before anyone had the language for it. Public records surfaced. Old photographs surfaced. The mythology and the biography collided, and the collision was made worse by early denials that turned into eventual acknowledgments. Work is work. A corrections officer job is not shameful. But the shame was never the point. The point was the gap, the space between the man he had sold the world and the man the world discovered. A shortcut nickname was born. Officer Ricky. That nickname was not an insult. That nickname was a file. Once the audience learns to file you, every future clip goes into the folder. Then came the lawsuit over the name. The rapper drew inspiration from Freeway Rick Ross, and the courts ultimately protected the rapper under artistic expression. A legal win closed the courtroom. It did not close the culture. Law and perception operate on entirely different calendars, and the perception file stayed open long after the judge stepped down. That distinction is the crack through which every future controversy has poured. And then, in 2024, the frame cracked wide open with the Drake situation. Ross and Drake once looked like the perfect commercial partnership. Stay schemin'. Aston Martin music. The Miami-Toronto luxury axis. Then the map redrew itself. The wider war involving Drake, Future, Metro Boomin, and half of the industry forced Ross to pick a side, and Rick Ross picked one loudly. Drake mentioned Rick Ross. Rick Ross answered with champagne moments. A former collaborator became a permanent target, and a diss record on its own would not have damaged the legacy at all. Hip-hop understands conflict. Hip-hop rewards nerve. Hip-hop remembers the sharpest lines. The problem is not that Rick Ross answered. The problem is what happened after the answer, and this is the part that changed the entire equation. Because in the months and quarters that followed, he kept returning to the same subject. Podcast clips, airport quotes, reaction posts, interview asides. Drake again. Drake again. Drake again. And here is the crushing truth of the current internet. An algorithm does not preserve context, and a comment section does not preserve nuance. A 10-minute conversation becomes one 12-second clip. A complicated dispute becomes one meme. And the question the audience began to ask stopped being who is right and quietly became who is preoccupied. That single shift in framing is the moment the empire started to feel smaller than the stage it was standing on. So step back for a second and look at the airport moment, because it is the perfect miniature of everything happening at once. Reports surfaced. Viral posts followed. Rick Ross was photographed at a commercial gate. He later explained the private jet was receiving a Starlink upgrade, that the trip to Colombia was work, and that flying commercial for one leg was practical. On a normal day, for a normal rapper, no story exists at all. Plenty of wealthy people fly commercial. But Ross was not walking through that terminal as a normal person. He was walking through it as a symbol whose audience had been trained to demand the private jet frame. The joke was already trending before the explanation could finish loading. The image had built the expectation, and the moment the image failed the expectation, the audit began. The jewelry discourse followed the exact same shape. Online commentators questioned stones. Watches were dissected frame by frame. Viral posts made appraisals no jeweler had asked. The receipts start being submissions to a jury that is already deliberating. Now here is the twist most commentators are refusing to say out loud. None of this erases the catalog. He is still connected to some of the most cinematic hooks the South ever produced. He built a real record label, moved real business into rap conversations, and made ambition sound like an entire film score. He remains one of the most identifiable voices in modern hip-hop history, and pretending the achievement never happened is intellectually dishonest. But legacy is not a spreadsheet. A spreadsheet can list albums, sales, awards, properties, franchises, partnerships. Legacy lives in emotional shorthand. Legacy is what an audience feels the second a name is spoken. And for a long time, the name Rick Ross meant grandeur. Right now, for a large slice of the internet, the same name means anticipation of a joke, a rebuttal, a feud update, an audit, a screenshot. That emotional shortcut is the real crisis, and it is more dangerous than any specific news cycle. Consider the difference between wealth and authority. Wealth can be shown. Authority is granted by an audience. He can show a car, a watch, a house, a jet, a business partnership, an aerial shot of an acreage. The public decides whether each display feels aspirational, defensive, or performative. And once the public starts leaning toward defensive, no additional luxury can command respect. The louder a brand insists on status, the more the crowd starts asking why the insistence sounds so urgent. That question is the invoice symbol fatigue mails to the door. There is a generational shift feeding this too. Older rap eras allowed mystique to live undisturbed. The audience heard the album, saw the magazine cover, accepted the world. Modern audiences freeze frames. Modern audiences compare dates. Modern audiences pull property records, remix interviews, screenshot rival clips, and build alternate narratives in hours. Every celebrity now operates under crowdsourced surveillance. He built an image designed for an audience that admired the illusion. He now performs for an audience that monetizes the inspection. Same music. Completely different courtroom. Pay attention to this next part, because the strategic answer is not what most fans expect. The answer is not to abandon luxury rap. Luxury rap remains Rick Ross territory, always will. The answer is to rewrite the contract with the audience. A stronger Rick Ross era would stop trying to convince strangers of wealth every week and would let the music, the business, and the honesty carry that proof on autopilot. Humor could neutralize old punchlines. Specific ownership could replace vague flexing. Strategic silence could create more gravity than another response clip. Imagine the next record opening with the contradiction addressed before every critic can raise it. Not defensive. Not wounded. Just precise. A line about mowing hundreds of acres because ownership means maintenance. A line about airports because travel is work, not theater. A line about old accusations because a past job paid bills long before fame paid bills. A line about rivals because a dominant career no longer needs a weekly opponent. That version of Rick Ross would turn the audit into an anthem, and the same audience currently tearing him down would suddenly be quoting him. And here is the hidden villain nobody is naming, so I will name it directly. The villain in the Rick Ross story is not Drake. It is not 50 Cent. It is not a jeweler on Instagram. It is not an airport camera. It is not a viral account with a laughing emoji. The villain is the gap. The gap between a carefully engineered symbol and an internet that profits from testing symbols. The internet does not need to prove an accusation to make an accusation travel. The internet only needs a clip that fits a familiar joke, and he has spent 2 decades unwittingly stocking the joke shelf. Every controversy connects back to one master question. Is the image real? The corrections officer story became bigger than the job. The name lawsuit became bigger than the case. The jewelry chatter became bigger than the jewelry. The airport clip became bigger than the flight. Each episode fed the same folder, and the folder now opens on autopilot every time a new clip lands. A mature response does not fight every file in the folder. A mature response changes the folder's title. The artist has the rare opportunity to reframe the entire narrative around one word: construction. Building companies. Building songs. Building runways for younger artists. Building a healthier relationship with the truth. The audience rewards transformation when transformation feels chosen. The audience punishes transformation when it only arrives after exposure. Right now, Rick Ross still has the door open to walk through the first version of that. Every month that passes without a new record, that door narrows. Music remains the cleanest route. No interview beats a song. No social post outperforms a chorus. No PR strategy carries the weight of a single verse that gives fans a new sentence to repeat back at his critics. This artist has built entire records around images the listener could see immediately. The next iconic image does not need a price tag in every frame. The next iconic image could be quieter, and therefore more powerful. Rick Ross in a room, counting lessons instead of objects. The same voice making wealth sound earned instead of merely displayed. And showing labor beside luxury, so grandeur no longer has to beg for applause. That is the record that flips the timeline. That is the record that turns symbol fatigue back into aura. Now zoom out for a second, because there is a business lesson buried in all of this that goes far beyond one rapper. Brands fail when brands confuse visibility with trust. Visibility can be purchased. Trust is earned by consistency over long stretches of time. Rick Ross has more visibility than almost any figure in his lane. He needs the type of moments that make the audience stop searching for the catch. A documented business win. A candid conversation about the mistakes. A creative project that swallows the news cycle whole. Any one of those beats 1,000 luxury close-ups. And to be fair, the audience has responsibilities too. Claims about watches, finances, ticketing, and travel deserve actual evidence. Public figures deserve criticism, but public figures also deserve some kind of standard. A viral clip is not a jeweler's appraisal. A screenshot is not a contract. A meme is not a verdict. At the same time, the artist cannot expect the public to unlearn 20 years of image-heavy conditioning overnight. Responsibility lives on both sides of the screen, and pretending otherwise is the fastest way to make everything worse. Which brings me to the sharpest observation I can make about this entire situation, and it is going to sound cruel because it is true. Rick Ross has already survived doubt. Rick Ross has already survived label politics. Rick Ross has already survived shifting taste. Rick Ross has already survived rivals with louder headlines. Survival is not the finish line anymore. Reinvention is. And the most valuable currency he has left is not another watch, another jet shot, another chef in the kitchen. The most valuable currency he has left is direction. Whoever decides the subject of the conversation controls the room. For a long time, Rick Ross controlled the room through atmosphere. A Rick Ross feature could make another artist sound wealthier before the second verse ever landed. A Rick Ross ad-lib could raise the ceiling of an entire song. A Rick Ross intro could open a gate above ordinary life. That power came from world building, not from debate, and every hour he spends debating rivals is another hour the world he built loses one more tenant. Picture a campaign built around a single phrase, maintenance of a masterpiece. Rick Ross shows the estate and also shows repairs. Rick Ross shows the jet and also shows the flight plan. Rick Ross shows the studio and also shows the revisions. Rick Ross shows the success and also shows the cost of sustaining that success. That campaign would not shrink the myth. That campaign would give the myth a foundation, and a foundation is the one thing the audit cannot demolish. Suddenly the critics saying he performs wealth hear the answer, Rick Ross performs stewardship. Suddenly the critics saying he talks about the lifestyle, watch him show the work behind the lifestyle. Suddenly the critics saying every image needs a defense find themselves watching an image that offers no target. You tell me what this looks like. Because from where I am standing, this is not the story of an empire ending. This is the story of an empire being forced to grow up in front of the camera. The next chapter will not be decided by a comment section, a jeweler clip, a rival post, an airport photo, or one screenshot of a ticket promo. The next chapter will be decided by choices that install a new emotional shortcut. He needs an audience that hears the name and thinks music first, presence second, and noise dead last. The castle is already built. The only remaining move is opening the gates without looking afraid of the crowd outside them. And here is the closing irony, the one I keep coming back to. Rick Ross spent an entire career making luxury sound untouchable. In this new era, the most valuable flex may be touchability. A clear truth. A well-timed joke. A colder silence. A stronger song. A better reason to look forward. Rick Ross does not need a bigger symbol. Rick Ross needs a story that survives the symbol. Because symbols get audited. Stories get quoted. And in 2026, the difference between those two words is the difference between an artist who fades and an artist who resets the whole conversation. So the question I want to hand you before this ends is not whether the empire is finished. Rick Ross is not finished. Careers do not end at this altitude, and the culture has watched too many premature obituaries turn into comeback records. The real question is more interesting than decline. Can Rick Ross make the audience feel scale again without demanding that the audience accept every symbol at face value? Can Rick Ross turn the audit into material? Can Rick Ross replace reaction with direction? Because the record that answers those 3 questions correctly is the record that resurrects the empire in a single afternoon. And the empire that refuses to answer them is the empire that watches the timeline decide the answer on its behalf. Now, with everything laid out on the table, tell me exactly where you stand. Is Rick Ross watching an empire crumble in real time, or is he standing at the precise coordinates where a myth can turn into something more human, more durable, and, honestly, more dangerous? Drop your take in the comments, the sharper the better, because this is the kind of debate the culture is going to keep having every time a new clip goes viral. If you made it this far into the breakdown, do me one small favor. Hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and turn the notifications on. Because we are about to walk through some of the biggest fault lines this genre has seen in a decade, and you are going to want the next chapter the moment it lands. And if you want to see the receipts on the other empire wobbling in real time right now, the exact story of how one Toronto superstar's algorithm play just backfired in the worst possible way. The video queued up next lays every piece of that puzzle on the table. Meet me over there. The map only gets more interesting from here.